Proper Pompey Podcast.
Supported by the Heritage Lottery Fund.
Hi, I'm Abbie.
And I'm Joe.
And this is the Proper Pompey Podcast. Over the last few months, we've been investigating the Portsmouth accent and dialect, researching its history.
And looking at how the way we speak influences people's sense of identity.
We thought a good first step would be to get the view of an expert, so we headed up to London to interview Jonnie Robinson, the British Library's lead curator of spoken English.
I've been fascinated with accents and dialects all my life, really. I think probably as a result of my own family background. I spent my early childhood in West Yorkshire, in Pontefract. My father's family are all from that area, and several of them speak in very broad Yorkshire dialect. My mother's side of the family are from the West Midlands, from the Black Country, and again, lots of family members speak Black Country dialect, and we moved there in my teenage years, and then as I went into sixth form, we moved down to Eastbourne. So I moved around quite a lot as a child and was exposed to sort of Yorkshire English, Black Country English, South Coast English, and then, of course, as many of us in my generation, moved around a lot with jobs. So I've always been fascinated with accents and dialects. The Portsmouth dialect's interesting, actually. Until relatively recently, most of our recordings here in the British Library and most research in the UK had focused on rural dialects. So there's very little evidence of historical Portsmouth dialect. In recent years, linguists have turned their attention to urban dialects, and therefore we've got a lot more data now on the Portsmouth accent. So in terms of the Portsmouth accent, I think what's interesting is obviously it's historically Hampshire, but it's very, very distinct from rural Hampshire. And obviously, as locals will know, the key difference is also between the other urban area in that area, Southampton. So I think locals are the experts on what those distinctive differences are. But certainly Portsmouth has a sort of a southeast English feel to it in terms of its accent, where perhaps rural Hampshire still has tiny pockets and echoes of maybe a more West Country sounding voice. I think the Portsmouth dialect, like many urban dialects, has evolved quite dramatically over the 19th, 20th century as the city grew. It's interesting because it's one of the few large urban areas in the southeast of England. Obviously, London dominates the southeast of England. But if we think of the north, there are lots of very recognisable urban accents in big cities like Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield, Liverpool that are very different from each other. So I don't think there's a lot of popular awareness of the Portsmouth accent, but I think it has aspects of southeast English, so there's lots of migration from London to the dockyards. It's interesting because it's a naval town, so there's lots of constant change of new voices coming in. It's very typical of a dialect contact area in the southeast of England, so I think there are pockets in the pronunciation of its traditional sort of Hampshire rural, so that vowel where people say right and I might sounds quite rural, and then you've got elements of very southeast English sounding pronunciation, so you get think and thing for think and thing, which sound quite London to some ears. There are a number of words that appear to be very widely used in Portsmouth that are perhaps not so common elsewhere, one of which is the wonderful term Dinlo, which is used, I think, normally quite affectionately for somebody who's a bit silly, a bit stupid, a bit foolish. It's actually a Romany word, Dinilo, originally. It's captured in the Oxford English Dictionary from about the 1870s. So it is widely known and has been, captured in authoritative reference sources. But it seems to be very, very closely centred on Portsmouth and Hampshire. We've got lots of sound recordings in our archives here at the British Library where people have contributed local words, and one of the most frequently contributed from Portsmouth is this word Dinlo, and other words, dinge for short for Dinlo, dinny for the adjective for being stupid. So it's clearly very much a well-recognised term in Portsmouth, but not widely used beyond that area. Another great word associated with Portsmouth, I think, is Squidy. That's a word that appears to have been around in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight for a long, long time. There was a wonderful dictionary published in the 19th century called the English Dialect Dictionary, the most comprehensive record of 19th century dialects. And Squidy is captured in the English Dialect Dictionary and listed as Hampshire only. So clearly it's a word that's been around for over 100 years in the area. It's still probably only really associated with Portsmouth and the surrounding area. Again, we've got evidence of that in our sound archives. The entry in the English Dialect Dictionary has a wonderful word derived from Squidy, which is Squinny guts, which is a sort of fretful or peevish child, it describes it, and again only used in Portsmouth and Isle of Wight. It would be great to know if that term still exists. There's a kind of equivalent in Northern English that the term Mardy equally describes a sort of a miserable, moody, sullen sort of person, and actually the term Mardy bum became kind of internationally known because, of course, Arctic Monkeys released a song, and so everybody knew the term. So it'd be great if a Portsmouth band released a song called Squinny Guts and kind of popularised that term too. So the term mush is used as a sort of a form of address to a mate or friend. Again, interestingly, it's a Romany word, so rather like Dinlo, it has links with the gypsy traveller community. It's actually used in quite a large number of dialects, but it does appear to be very, very widely used in Portsmouth across all sorts of social groups. Interestingly, in our archives, it's one of the ones that's contributed by young speakers, so it's clearly still very much widely used by all sorts of age groups, but not necessarily just an exclusively Portsmouth word. I understand the term "we" is quite widely used in Portsmouth. I think among young speakers as a kind of expression of surprise or astonishment or excitement. We've not got any record of that, actually, interesting, in our glossaries and dictionaries and sound archives here at the British Library, but having a quick look online, there's all sorts of evidence of this, and it does point to Portsmouth and that sort of area. Lots of references on things like Urban Dictionary, where this word is captured. I've no idea of its origins. It possibly has links with maybe text speak. You can imagine how if you spell W and then 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 E's, it captures that sound as a kind of exclamation of surprise. So maybe it's evidence of a kind of a new word that's emerged through new technology and then now used by speakers in speech as well. I think the fact that Portsmouth's a naval town is very interesting in terms of its language. Obviously, it means that there are large numbers of speakers who come into the area from outside. So it's a typical area that linguists would acknowledge as an area ripe for dialect contact. So I imagine it explains why, for instance, lots of new words are adopted quite quickly. Lots of new slang terms maybe come into Portsmouth dialect very quickly because there's people coming from all parts of the country. I think it's also interesting because it means that there's a constant refreshing of language, but also I think what's interesting about Portsmouth is it's a very densely populated city. It's one of the largest cities in the southeast of England outside London, 200,000 people, but it's the population density that linguists often acknowledge as a sort of breeding ground for rich intensity of local dialect. Isolated communities are much more likely to retain traditional features of speech. It would be wrong to say that Portsmouth's an isolated community. It might be an island city, but it's very well linked into surrounding areas. But certainly that idea of it as a sort of slightly other, its own sense of self, I think, in Portsmouth is maybe promoted by that notion of it being an island city. And I think what's most important for Portsmouth is the large numbers of speakers, the stability of population. So this notion that Portsmouth's been a big urban area for a long time, and that speech patterns get passed across the generations, but also the local dense networks contribute to that. So I think it's an interesting theory and contributes to it, but it would be wrong to consider Portsmouth isolated from its surrounding linguistic areas. I think what's interesting in recent years about dialect and slang and areas of local accent and local linguistic identity is that it's become much more visible since the advent of the internet. So where previously dialect was kind of hidden, it was spoken, but it wasn't captured in print, it wasn't captured in newspapers, in broadcast media. There may have been a local dialect publication phenomenon, the odd dialect poetry, that kind of thing. But nowadays we're all authors really, and we all tend to want to create our own identity online. So particularly young speakers are very, very creative in using local language on things like Twitter. So there's lots and lots of evidence for linguists to look at for local Portsmouth words like Squidy and Dinlo, which are widely used on Twitter, whereas maybe 20, 30 years ago we wouldn't have any sense of how widely those words were being used by speakers in certain areas. So I think social media is interesting because it's kind of given dialect and slang a new visibility, if you like, and almost authentified it. Dialects have often been perceived as being under threat. The first ever survey of British dialects was called the Survey of English Dialects, done in the 1950s. And this was undertaken by linguists at the University of Leeds because they were convinced that dialect was disappearing and changing very dramatically. To a certain extent, they were right that in some parts of the country it was changing quite dramatically. But actually, I think most linguists would nowadays agree that dialect isn't disappearing, it's just changing. And if we think of the UK, we are all very aware of distinctions between the north and the south, between Scotland and England, and even locally, it's very important that there's a distinction between, say, Portsmouth and Southampton, and locals will know and recognise that. So I think perhaps this idea that dialects are dying is maybe exaggerated. Globalisation has an impact, but interestingly, it also perhaps means that dialect is more visible because we are all now communicating with each other across the globe and we are using our own versions of speech to do that. linguists often talk about dialect change and dialect continuity, and dialect change typically occurs in a place where there's a big upheaval of population or a dramatic change in population. So in British context, rural southeast England has had a huge change in terms of its population and identity in the last 50, 60 years. So where rural Hampshire was very much an agricultural area with lots of farm labourers growing up in the same village and passing on the same job to their descendants, that maintained dialect stability across centuries until maybe post-Second World War. Now, urban areas obviously haven't seen quite such dramatic change. Portsmouth's been a big city for 100, 150 years, 200,000 people. Therefore, there is that sheer mass of population and that continuity that enables dialect to pass from generation to generation. So I think it's numbers of people, it's stability of population, but it's also, crucially, identity. And cities that have a very well-established sense of self often find, so somewhere like Liverpool has a very keen sense of its own identity and therefore is a very recognisable accent. I think Portsmouth likewise, associations with the Navy, the Dockyard, the football club, all mean that Portsmouth has quite a strong local sense of itself.
That was interesting, wasn't it?
I think we all learnt something new there. Tune in next week to learn about Jodie Silsby, a graphic designer who created a map of Portsmouth.
Proper Pompey Podcast.
Supported by the Heritage Lottery Fund.